Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. Today, our team is going to tell you a story. The story of cash in Canada. Cash, represented by banknotes and coins, were invented in China about the same time that I was born, in the 10th century. And it has been around exactly for the same purpose that it has been used or it is used today, to facilitate the exchange of goods and services and make our lives a lot easier. Think about this for a second. The first interaction that human beings tend to have with the idea of finance, financial responsibility, or the discipline of economics is via cash and piggy banks as children. But things are changing. I want to bring attention to some of the headlines that you'll see on our screens and focus on the last two images on the bottom left. With increasing levels of digitization, people are preferring to use less and less cash to buy goods and services and more digital payment tools, such as credit cards, debit cards, and so forth. Merchants are responding by accepting less cash or nudging consumers away from cash usage. But on the flip side, with higher levels of digitization, it is only natural to see digital disruptions. Remember the Rogers power outage last summer? Hell yeah. And most importantly, what this is doing is the following. Cash becomes the only viable payment method during emergencies. But beyond these quantitative narratives, there is another story of cash, the role of cash in the lives of vulnerable populations. It is within this climate that the Bank of Canada has asked Haley, Sakema, Megan, and I to explore the following question. What are the social policy implications for a less cash society, and how might it impact different vulnerable groups or different groups? Now, we can't tell you the whole story today, but we will tell you a part of that story. You are more than welcome to read the 70 plus pages that we've written for our report on a lovely summer day, but we'll leave you to it. We're going to divide our presentation into 3 sections: context and approach, key findings, and the 4 policy recommendations that we are presenting to the Bank of Canada to ensure that a less cash society does not leave any community behind. So let's get the ball rolling.
So what is a less cash society? Less cash is referring to the observed trend of declining cash use, acceptance, and access. The reason we use the term less cash is because it's speaking to the process of moving away from cash to digital payment tools, whereas cashless is more of a state. Despite the trend towards more digital alternatives, cash is a payments method that is likely to continue to be used alongside different online payment tools. A couple of trends to speak to. Cash use for daily purchases declined from 54% in 2009 to 22% in 2021. A report by a fintech company predicts that this figure might decrease further to even 3% in 2025. Despite the increased trend for digital payments and e-commerce activity, demand for cash still remains at its highest level in 60 years. During the pandemic, there was the preconceived notion that cash use would decrease due to hygiene or convenience purposes, but we saw more people were likely to hoard cash. People's day-to-day transactions tended not to be in cash, yet the store value function that cash serves increased, especially regarding the volume of notes circulating during the early pandemic. These are just a couple trends surveyed from the general population and sets the tone that there may be some wariness around this transition. Therefore, these paradoxical patterns forced us to question, what is the appeal of cash? How can these conflicting notions between human behavior for spending and storing cash exist simultaneously in the payments landscape? And what would these social policy implications be? As a starting point, we turn to the Bank of Canada mandate. The Bank of Canada is Canada's central bank, whose responsibilities include anchoring monetary policy, the functioning of the financial system, authority of currency issuance, funds management, and retail payment supervision. In the Bank of Canada Act, the goal of the central bank noted in their preambulatory clause is to promote financial and economic welfare of Canada, as well as to regulate the credit and currency in the best economic life of the nation. This denotes that BOC has the institutional capacity and duty to ensure reasonable access to cash and to put down safeguards to account for changes in the economic and financial landscape. With these objectives as part of our guiding pillars, we have approached our project scope to be directed by the Bank of Canada mandate, as well as pushing the boundaries of traditional central bank activities.
By now, it is clear to us that less cash is a transitional process, a societal shift away from the heavy reliance on physical cash. However, we must consider the social implications of this transition. During our time together this afternoon, we will be discussing population groups that are often overlooked in extensive research. As part of our project, we got to select our own groups, and we decided to narrow down to the social implications of a less cash society on the lives of Indigenous peoples, unhoused individuals, survivors of domestic abuse, and older people that is age 60 and above. To initiate our research exploration, we began by reviewing the Bank of Canada mandate, as Kema had pointed to, and conducted extensive literature and stakeholder consultations. In these consultations, we heard from 25 influential voices, including advocacy groups representing our identified groups. This enriched our research approach, allowing us to hear real-world perspectives and unveil stories that remain untold by numerical data. While we acknowledge that there are undeniable benefits to a less cash society, we must also confront the potential negatives it brings for marginalized individuals. Today, we shed light on crucial aspects that demand our attention. The purpose of our target recommendations are to find ways to mitigate the negative implications of a less cash society and to promote financial inclusion. We will take you on a journey to understand why financial inclusion is critical in our society. The World Bank defines as a financially included individual as one who possesses and utilizes formal financial products and services such as bank account, credit, insurance, and access to cash. So the question arises, do our identified groups believe they are financially included in the evolving payments landscape? This leads us to share our first key insight. One of our initial findings in the early stages of our research was that there's a lack of trust and reliance on banks among marginalized individuals. This is a problem. In a society where cash use is becoming less prevalent, establishing strong relationships with banks becomes incredibly critical. Marginalized individuals, including Indigenous peoples, unhoused individuals, and older people, perceive themselves excluded from banks. They report fears of discrimination and encounters with unconscious bias from frontline staff. The lack of trust is a catalyst for a phenomenon called underbanking. Underbanking is when a person has access to an account but underutilizes the services provided by financial institutions. While 3% of Canadians remain unbanked, meaning they have no formal relationship with banks, there are up to 15% that are underbanked. If marginalized individuals do not feel a sense of inclusivity and unbiased service from frontline banking personnel, they will naturally seek alternative avenues to access cash services. This leads us to our second insight. There is limited bank access for vulnerable communities. The issue extends beyond the lack of trust. There's a decline in bank branches in Canada, especially in rural communities. The closure of banks results in limited convenience for individuals, prompting them to turn to costlier fringe bank services like check cashing outlets, think Money Mart, payday lenders, and pawn shops. However, convenience comes with a significant cost. Fringe banks offer service, loans, tax refund advances, and access to cash through privately owned white labels, and these services come with higher expense and hidden fees. I'm sure we have all used a white label ATM and from experience can mention that the service fee for withdrawing cash is higher than what a bank-owned ATM would cost. So vulnerable individuals have challenges accessing credit due to factors such as low credit scores and irregular income. If there's growing dependence on exploitative fringe banks in a less cash society, and banks continue to fall short of serving all consumers equitably, exclusion will persist. And challenges faced by marginalized individuals will worsen. What are these challenges, you may ask? Before sharing further key stakeholder insights, let me take a moment to explain what we mean by a financial exclusion, as this is what we have discovered to be the negative social implication of a less cash society. Financial exclusion is closely linked with social exclusion, and it refers to the inability to access and utilize banking services such as low-cost bank accounts. Other emerging themes from our finding is that financial exploitation and financial abuse are complex dimensions of financial exclusion. And in a less cash society, this heightens the risk for some marginalized communities using non-cash payments and digital banking tools. Financial exclusion involves the unethical use of someone's financial resources for personal gain. Imagine an elderly person who is unfamiliar with digital banking tools and has to rely on family members. They could fall victim to money being stolen from family members. And this is actually pretty common from what we heard from stakeholders. Financial abuse refers to the manipulation of an individual's assets in an imbalanced power dynamic. For example, domestic abusers may control their partner's access to cash and bank accounts, leaving them financially dependent and unable to meet their basic needs. Without sufficient safeguards, transitioning to a less cash society magnifies financial exclusion for identified groups. Before exploring potential solutions, we must also consider the role, impact, and significance of cash for vulnerable communities.
This brings us to one of our most essential insights. Cash presents an unparalleled utility to many. As Megan said earlier, some of these trends come from the literature, and many come from our very valuable stakeholder insights. So first, low volume transactions are most likely to be paid in cash. In fact, 40% of transactions under $15 are typically paid in cash. Secondly, there is a preference for keeping savings and emergency funds in cash. This is because cash is secure, universal, accessible, anonymous, and provides people a sense of control over their finances. Which brings us to the third insight. Cash is accessible and is frequently used as a tool for budgeting. Its accessibility lies in its physicality. You can touch and feel cash, which helps people with low financial literacy save money. In fact, if you were to go to a workshop or class and learned how to budget, the advice you'd most likely receive is to keep cash in envelopes or jars. Budgeting in cash prevents overspending or reliance on credit. This is due to a psychological phenomenon called pocket watching behavior. If you have cash in your pocket, you are unlikely to want it to leave your pocket. Additionally, cash contains tactile dots on the corner of every bill, which were designed in consult with low vision communities in Canada. Essentially, cash is reliable, easy to monitor, and prevents people from relying on credit. Fourth, cash is familiar during emergencies. Whether it is a network outage, like Aftab mentioned earlier, or the pandemic, you see increased demand during times of uncertainty like COVID. This demonstrates a sense of security inherent in cash. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly to our project, cash represents an irreplaceable role in the lives of vulnerable groups. I will give an example now from each of the groups that we focused on. In many Indigenous communities, cash is a means of payment used for social events and traditional occasions. In fact, specific Indigenous monetary customs and cultural practices are not yet integrated into digital payment systems. Many unhoused people rely on panhandling to fund their necessities. During the pandemic, fewer people carried cash because of reduced cash usage, which meant that panhandlers in turn earned less. Victims of domestic abuse are advised to keep cash as a quote-unquote getaway fund. This is because cash is untraceable to abusers, and given an increased likelihood of financial abuse and exploitation, this is very important for the eventual autonomy of these victims. And lastly, older Canadians see cash as a secure tool for financial management and paying for goods and services. Digital payment systems could lead to increased reliance on others, which makes older people susceptible to financial abuse. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition into our recommendations.
Now, we've established that financial exclusion is the primary social implication of a less cash society. So the antidote to exclusion is inclusion. Therefore, we recommend that the Bank of Canada conduct an internal strategic review to embed financial inclusion as an institutional priority. Now, we've established also that the Bank of Canada Act's preamble states that the central bank is the custodian of Canada's economic and financial welfare. However, there is no publicly accessible definition of how the central bank perceives economic and financial welfare. We see this as an opportunity. An internal strategic review can be leveraged to A, define economic and financial welfare, and B, define it via 5 specific parameters, namely monetary stability, economic stability, financial stability, sustainable economic growth, and financial inclusion. These parameters mutually reinforce one another and as such should be thought about, deliberated under a single cohesive framework. Now, you may ask, why should the central bank take the issue of financial inclusion more seriously? Well, number one, financial inclusion is indeed within the jurisdiction of another department called the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. However, the central bank, given its credibility, given its international stature, given its ability to be a thought leader, has the capacity to promote inclusion and do so in a cohesive framework. And hence, we are recommending an internal strategic review to embed financial inclusion alongside the other important parameters as we've discussed. The last thing that I will mention about this is this. Why is this called Recommendation 0? Well, it's called Recommendation 0 because it forms the normative basis for all of the other recommendations that you will see right after. The Bank of Canada is an agenda setter. When the Bank of Canada says something, economic actors listen. And if the Bank of Canada says that financial inclusion should be a priority in a less cash society, other financial institutions, including banks, will take that issue more seriously. So we'll move on to our first recommendation, or Recommendation 1, which touches upon a component of inclusion, which is reasonable cash access.
So one of the problems that we discussed earlier is that as financial institutions adjust to less cash, bank branches are closing and consolidating their services. Banks are profit motivated, which means that financial institutions are not inherently closing the gaps in cash access. This presents a market failure. Additionally, ATM density issues impact those in both rural and urban communities. There is no system currently for ensuring that those who require cash can access it, and the increase of white label ATMs as well as fringe banks mean that accessing cash already has costs, and financial exclusion is impacting these vulnerable groups. Therefore, we have Recommendation 1, which is a data-driven approach in order to meet the needs of vulnerable people in various communities. Bank of Canada should leverage their mandate in order to facilitate a policy solution that creates no-cost ATMs in communities that request them, and we call this program the Community Cash Connect, or CCC. This presents a private-public partnership and shared responsibilities between the Bank of Canada and financial institutions. More specifically, the Bank of Canada will be receiving applications and then will conduct feasibility assessments in order to determine if people have adequate access to cash. Factors that will be assessed include distance to nearest no-cost ATM, geographic barriers to cash access, or recent bank closures. In an agreement with the Big Six banks, which are Canada's 6 biggest banks, cost and maintenance will be split to provide cash services at no cost. The Bank of Canada will oversee installation and coordinate with financial institutions to ensure that any technical issues are sorted within a reasonable time frame. This recommendation is not top-down. It allows a community's members to take ownership of whether or not they need better access to cash. It speaks to the needs of a community and considers circumstances specific to the set of people requesting the ATM. Feasibility assessments also look beyond quantitative data and show other obstacles to accessing cash. However, social policy implications clearly go beyond access to cash. As we discussed earlier, precarious relationships between vulnerable people and their bank accounts are another implication that we feel needs addressing. So therefore, we have our recommendation too.
We've established that banks at times lack an understanding of the specific needs of vulnerable groups, and this erodes trust. To tackle this problem, we are proposing the introduction of tailored codes of conduct to promote inclusive and accessible banking. Recommendation 2 calls upon the Bank of Canada to advocate to the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, that Aftab had referred to earlier, to develop codes that address the specific needs of our identified groups and enhance their trust in banks. Codes outline ethical practices and prioritize consumer protection, and can be designed to address the challenges faced by unhoused individuals, Indigenous peoples, and victims of financial abuse. The inspiration for this code comes from the existing Code of Conduct for the Delivery of Banking Services for Seniors, which outlines expectations for banks to follow when providing services to customers age 60 and above. While inclusive banking for seniors is salient, we believe codes should be written to assist those in other identity groups who face financial exclusion and are most impacted by the pattern of less cash. I'll give you an example. Because homeless people face difficulties in opening bank accounts due to a lack of ID and home address, the code that we are recommending should be designed to take into account these challenges. This code should adopt principles that facilitate access to basic financial services for homeless people to promote their financial empowerment. As part of this recommendation, we are calling for the revision of the Seniors Code to incorporate language on inclusive and accessible technology platforms. The current code focuses on seniors aged 60 and up, but it is essential to acknowledge that older people should not be treated as a homogeneous group. Older seniors, or super seniors aged 75 and above, are susceptible to unique vulnerabilities, including cognitive decline and physical impairments that hinder service accessibility. The benefit of this recommendation is that we are not reinventing the wheel here. We are developing codes to cater to the unique needs of other vulnerable groups beyond seniors to promote and prioritize financial inclusion. The path to a successful less cash society requires strong relationships with banks. Voluntary codes ensure fairness and responsibility in the banking industry and protect the rights and interests of those who are underbanked. However, a successful transition to a less cash society is one that prioritizes freedom of choice. While the frequency of cash use recedes, the freedom to opt for cash remains a cherished attribute. The essence of choice for vulnerable communities beyond the ones we have researched holds undeniable weight that should be investigated by a cash access committee.
The last recommendation is the Cash Access Committee, which was inspired by the UK's 2019 Link model titled Access to Cash Review. This was created in response to the rapid decline in cash use, coupled with the growing concerns that we're leaving people behind who can't use or access cash. The creation of this committee is based on the question we asked ourselves regarding if there was a potential call to action for the legislative protection of cash. Thus, the overarching goal is to assess the necessity of statutory changes to protect cash, as well as to outline measures for implementing safeguards. As a group, we've been moved by the anecdotes we've heard from advocacy groups and subject matter experts related to the vulnerable groups and their experience with cash. However, we also recognize that our outreach is limited. So this recommendation is a means to expand on these sentiments by tasking the central bank to create a committee investigating cash trends, access, and usage to ensure financial inclusion for the future of cash. Through looking at the broad metrics of legitimacy, relevance, and the social acceptability of cash, we can begin to paint a picture that understands consumer needs around cash and what those implications might be for the future. This would be planned as a BOC-funded and appointed cash access committee with inclusion and social cohesion in mind. However, the committee would be made up of independent external experts, ranging from policy, legal, economic experts, as well as advocacy groups and subject matter experts that work directly with vulnerable populations to leverage the institutional capacity and the soft power of the BOC pertaining to their research and data gathering strengths, while also onboarding stakeholder engagement from marginalized populations to incorporate an EDI and person-centered approach. Through considering consumer requirements for access and impact for cash in a less cash society, the committee can then propose evidence-based policy recommendations going forward. The deliverables would be an interim and final report with an extra research period in between titled the Call for Evidence period, where the interim report would be released to the public and those findings would be consolidated and integrated into the final product. This recommendation is a way of reflecting on the payments infrastructure and recognizing that financial inclusion includes, but also goes beyond just having financial access to services, ensuring diversity and quality of those services matter just as much. Some populations are cash dependent for a variety of reasons, so this recommendation lays the groundwork to investigate whether this evidence warrants the legislative protection of cash. We believe that this recommendation is forward-facing to the future of cash, and after all of the data gathering and research, if the committee's final report suggests that cash is still viable as a payments method, then future policy should align as such to effectively and sincerely follow through with the notion of evidence-based financial inclusion for all populations. Having said that, let's see how all of our recommendations work in conjunction with one another.
The story we are trying to tell is one of financial exclusion. This element already existed in society prior to the Less Cash movement. There are no miracle cures for financial exclusion, and our recommendations are not intended to be miracle cures. Less cash is an issue that many of us are privileged enough not to worry about, but has devastating consequences for many, increasing anxiety for already vulnerable people. Which brings us to this lovely diagram. Recommendation 0 says that Bank of Canada, as the central bank, should consider inclusion as part of day-to-day operations, embedding into their understanding of banknote distribution and empowering the bank to take on an advocacy role. Most importantly, this positions the bank to take on a leadership role in the implementation of the rest of our recommendations. We asked ourselves, how will those who require cash be able to access it in a less cash society? Our answer is recommendation 1, provide cash to those who request it. This band-aids the issue, but a less cash future is especially problematic in conjunction with underbanking. In order to improve the relationship of vulnerable groups with financial institutions, codes should be written that address the issues faced by the marginalized. We do not know the complete extent of the influence of less cash in the long term. We believe that further investigation is warranted, as we said in Recommendation 3. Ensuring legislative protection of access to cash is considered as a policy solution. The intended result of this is to reduce financial exclusion exacerbated by less cash for the 4 groups we identified: Indigenous peoples, unhoused people, survivors of domestic abuse, and older people. Cash, as a relic, holds its own. It remains a secure buffer and a reliable financial vehicle. While it is not a daily necessity for many of us, its availability symbolizes a form of financial freedom that should remain possible for all those who desire it. Just before we wrap up, I would like to thank all of our parents who are watching this live stream in Kenya, Bangladesh, the US, and Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you, team. You get the prize. You still have 1:25 in the bank. You get to cash that in tonight for a drink. Okay. So, all right. Who's kicking us off from the jurors?
I want to know about that $1.25 in cash. Yeah. So I'm going to use that 1 minute and 25 seconds for first time ever a double-barreled question. Oh yeah, you're really in luck. So I guess my first question is really around the mandate that you got, which was to look at protecting marginalized individuals and groups in a less cash society. And I think you've done a great job about explaining the value of cash and why in certain circumstances it's a really useful tool for those marginalized communities. But I would be interested in whether your observations, whether you would have any additional recommendations for what you described as a less cash society. So take as a given that we might go from 15% of cash transactions down to 2%. So in that case, what additional recommendations would you have for a less cash society, but recognizing there might still be a need for a little bit of cash? Shall I give you my second question, or
Sure,
is it
you can
easier
go
just
ahead.
to do one at a time? Okay, so my second question is, this might be completely off the wall, Christine, but why do we actually need cash? Like, why would it not be possible? You guys are smiling. You probably thought of this, but why is it not possible instead to have the CRA kick out my tax rebate in a Bank of Canada Sunshine card for a value of $110? Why do we actually have to have cash?
I'll take a second. Go
Cool.
first.
Okay, so one of the things, so firstly, the question was not around vulnerable populations. We made it about vulnerable populations. So the question was, and I'll repeat this again, what are the social policy implications for a less cash society and how might it impact different groups? We scoped it down to cash-dependent populations. And as you rightly said, we found out that cash-dependent populations value cash, not simply because of its transactional utility, but because of the plethora of reasons that we sort of highlighted in our presentation. If the Bank of Canada was not our sponsor, because we had to be careful about that as well. We had to know what the Bank of Canada can do versus what the Bank of Canada could not do, right? So if a less cash society is to work for everyone, and as you said, the first thing that needs to happen is universal access to technology, perhaps. Every single human being does not have a cell phone in this country, right? That's one thing that would need to sort of be an area of focus. Digital access. We heard about internet connectivity issues across Indigenous communities. That was a massive challenge. Everyone needs universal internet access. That needs to be a priority in a less cash society. There were additional factors, and I'll just touch on this before leaving it to Haley. Cash holds a special place for certain vulnerable populations which digital innovation will not be able to replace. And we highlight the story of survivors of domestic abuse. In a digital payments landscape, a survivor of domestic abuse is more prone to abuse because of the monitoring and tracking that happens on digital payment platforms. An abuser, if they are your joint account holder, will be able to monitor your transactions and be able to see where you're spending and so forth. And the recommendation that we got from our advocacy groups was that you need to have cash in place simply because it allows, say, a survivor of domestic abuse to have a getaway fund if and when it is required. So for all those reasons, I think cash still holds value. But Haley, if you want to add anything else. Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, I just want to correct the statistic earlier, which is that right now cash is representing 22% of all transactions. What the statistic about the 15% was, it's 40% of all transactions under $15 right now. So to answer your second question, building off of Aftab's response about why cash still matters for vulnerable groups, our approach to our recommendations was to implement solutions that are tailored to their current needs without imposing top-down structures that we felt would be difficult to adapt to. And we had a case study to back up this approach. In Australia, they used what kind of debit cards? Cashless debit cards to work on this issue. And essentially, we heard from a stakeholder who was doing research on the implementation of these cashless debit cards that the communities that received them felt stigmatized by their use and felt that it was not actually adapting to their needs, but rather an approach that was prescribing their needs. And that was, in Australia. So that was essentially why we took on this approach to work with people where they are, adapting to the needs of communities, given the fact that we saw that cash is very valuable to so many people as of right now. Thank you.
Okay, Ian or Shaq?
I'm just thinking about the Swedish currency that I have sitting at home. I was on a business trip last year in Sweden and went and took out some cash before I left and found out nobody took it. There are very few places accept cash, and they're moving quite aggressively, as I understood it, in Sweden to move away. It's an interesting point raised by my colleague that they combine that with the importance of getting broadband connectivity to everyone and everyone having a bank account or some form of institutional identity where they can then use cards or other sorts. So it's a bit of an interesting anecdote. I'll shift over to your codes. I'm very interested in that and how that might work. As part of our work at the CRTC, we developed a number of consumer codes to, I'll call it, help service providers make sure they were communicating clearly to consumers and you know, in ways that less educated or those with, you know, language challenge or whatever can understand terms and conditions. So I just like a bit of a better understanding about how that would work. And to your point about stigmatizing potential users, how do they get applied? How does that get operationalized? For example, in a financial institution, you're Indigenous, you go to counter number 1. I'm obviously making a crass example, but perhaps you could elaborate on that, please.
Will do. So the great benefit of the code recommendation is the fact that we are taking inspiration from the Seniors Code, which actually came into force in July 2019 and it was fully implemented in January 2021. So for the development of these codes, we're hoping that FCAC, in collaboration with the Canadian Bankers Association, which is an association that represents more than 60 domestic and foreign banks. And so what they would do is take time to consult stakeholders, reach out to industry experts, reach out to communities to understand the relationships that they have with banks, and outline principles within these codes. And then the banks would be able to come up with policies. So it's really an industry-driven policy. And the benefit to that is the fact that banks would align with these codes as part of their corporate social responsibility, because there's a threat to regulate should they not implement these codes. And so a specific example of a code is for the Code of Conduct for the Delivery of Banking Services to Indigenous Peoples. And as part of that code, we're recommending an emphasis of cultural sensitivity and to expand literacy programs and promote the recruitment of Indigenous frontline bankers. And this also aligns with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to Action 92, whereby they state that corporate Canada should adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework. So that's just to give you an example of why these codes would be beneficial. And the good thing about them is that banks have already been seen to comply with the Seniors Code, in that they're required to publish annual reports on how they're meeting the needs of the individuals they're serving. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Shaq.
My question's for your first recommendation, the Community Cash Program. Like you rightly mentioned, banks are financially motivated. So I'm just curious, what's the incentive of them to actually do this, right? The big 6 banks are just going to put ATMs wherever they're needed. There was no cost mentioned in your presentation. What would that cost them? Why would they work together if they're competitors? So I'm just curious how this would all kind of play itself out.
It's an excellent question. So we thought a lot about banks as profit-motivated entities and how we could work with in a private-public partnership with the Bank of Canada and the big 6 banks. First of all, the idea was supposed to be that there would be a memoranda of understanding in the implementation of these ideas into individual corporate social responsibility policies, which are outlined in the longer version of the brief. And then secondly, ultimately, we do believe that there is justification for this based on some of the international examples we looked at. Sweden, as mentioned by our other juror, has a completely different philosophical approach to ATMs within the country. They're used as cost centers where they share, individual banks essentially share the utility of ATMs. They use the same machinery, and it reduces their cost in the long term. I do think there's a case for that in Canada as well, that utilizing one ATM to access multiple different bank branches' accounts would reduce costs in the long term. And then just to kind of bring it back to the essence of your question about why would banks as profit-motivated entities implement this, we are hoping that Recommendation 0 lays a framework in which the central bank could use their advocacy role to implement that memorandum of understanding I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Aftab, are you going to add something there?
Can I just add an example? So one example that I'll provide to you is this is based on personal experience. So I used to work at TD, and TD has existing frameworks in place which states that they are committed to enhancing financial inclusion in rural communities. They also have frameworks in place which states that they want to create connected communities where they want to provide basic financial services to all Canadians. Now, if these are empty words on paper, that's another story in itself. But I think the ATM framework that we are proposing provides banks across this country an opportunity to put their money where they're putting their words out there, right? Like it gives them a chance to actually respond to their own commitments to the public. And that, I think, is a very important thing that we're trying to say here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next 10 minutes is for sponsors and coaches. So Jonathan and or Christine, and then Olivia.
I'll ask the first question. My name is John Champagne from the Bank of Canada. I had the pleasure of working with this team over the last year or so on their project. So thanks again. You did a great job. I guess my question is just more of just kind of to dig a little bit, into your experience doing the project. At the bank, we often are looking at the data, the numbers, with the legislation, the policy, and we miss a little bit of, maybe what's on the ground in the sense of what are stakeholders, people thinking, seeing, and feeling. And, you were able to reach out to a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and we saw that whole list of all the different groups that you spoke to about their experience with financial exclusion and cash. And if you have like one or two, experiences that you got from speaking to those stakeholders that maybe couldn't quite fit in the report, but kind of like stuck in your mind, or something that you wanted to share about one or two of those stakeholders, I think we'd be, I know I'd be kind of interested in hearing that.
So I don't have an example specifically of like one that couldn't fit into the report, but the population of Indigenous peoples is such a huge population with extreme cultural diversity. And the case study of Australia that we talked about, where the government implemented the cashless debit card, was a very striking one for me, because the sentiment that we've also heard from stakeholders is not the sense that they don't want to transition to a less cash society. It's more so that they feel that they're not being given the tools and support needed to be able to do so successfully. And in the case of the Indigenous population in Australia, it was more a sense of this was imposed upon them because of preconceived notions about how they were spending and making purchases, which is why they were trying to force them to get onto the debit card. But the overarching theme that we got from the stakeholders that we really resonated with was the idea that they are not reluctant by choice. It's more so a byproduct of their circumstances, and the fact that these populations have such different needs for cash and yet still are able to agree on the same notion that if they were given the support that they needed via some of the solutions that we believe are in our recommendations, then they would believe that the transition to a less cash society would be more helpful. Thank you.
So I think one of the things that we kept hearing from all of our stakeholders was this idea of that we're sleepwalking towards a less cash society or cashless society, however you want to call it, without appropriate stopgaps in place. And I keep sort of repeating the story of the survivors of domestic abuse and the importance that cash plays in their lives. You know, I didn't want to bring this up, but another thing that sort of came up was the central bank digital currency, for example. The central bank digital currency would probably not alleviate the concerns of a survivor of domestic abuse who is going to try and leverage cash as a medium to escape from their potential abuser. Now, these are conversations that I think we need to have, and you can't have it in a silo only through the lens of a payments landscape. You need to have it through the lens of how well Canada is being able to enhance its internet connectivity across the board. You need to have those conversations based on, well, does a person have a bank account versus does a person have a bank account and is using their bank account on a day-to-day basis. People, one of the things we heard, and you might find this interesting, is that people who may be financially included, quote unquote, because they have a bank account, leverage their bank account simply as a medium to receive their social assistance payments. They cash out their money and they repeat that cycle on a monthly or a bi-weekly basis. So all they're doing with their bank account is leveraging it as a tool to receive their funds, take cash out, and they use cash on a day-to-day basis. Low-cost bank accounts are one of the tools via which the federal government sort of tries to bring people on board. But even low-cost bank accounts, the lowest cost bank account at TD costs $3.95. It gives you 12 transactions. But think about yourselves. Do you think you do 12 transactions a month? Probably not. You probably at least do one transaction a month. So that's 30 transactions. So you end up paying a lot of fees. So bottom line is financial inclusion is not simply about access, but it's about how well that access is resulting in an increased sort of standard of living in a person's life. And those were sort of some interesting findings.
Just like to point out that Aftab is no longer working on commission for TD.
I think they're listening in.
Okay.
So
I
that's
see.
a
Okay. Christine, and then Olivia.
So congratulations. You know, I want to commend the students because I think you've done an amazing job over the period of time that you've been working with us to develop a facility, develop a language around the cash ecosystem, and an understanding. So I think that's very well done. I really appreciated the questions from the jury. They're all very insightful questions, and some of which we ask as well. And particularly the question in relationship to the ATM proposal really has tweaked my mind. I think of policy development, policy making as a bubble. And if you push in one place, there's going to be give somewhere else. And when I think about my experience working with financial institutions and regulation, if you require a behavior that costs money in one place, it's going to have impact somewhere else because, you know, they're profit motivated. So my question for you is, with regards to the two recommendations that you have around ATMs, I'm wondering how you thought about the economic repercussions for the firms involved, and whether you identified what kind of behaviors they may have in response to new requirements from the recommendations.
It's an excellent question. And thank you. Oh, by the way, I want to say that Bank of Canada has been truly incredible to work with, and I'm so grateful for this experience with you all. So the first thing that comes to mind is I want to bring up the fact that there has been successful implementation of a very similar program in the UK, which was run by Link, which did the same access to cash review that Kema spoke about in reference to recommendation 3. Now, Link, as you know, is a payments network, as opposed to something like this where we're talking about a private-public partnership. However, the program itself was widely successful, and over 100 ATMs have been implemented as a result. So given that, we did think about the costs to financial institutions. That's part of the reason why we specified Big Six banks, as they have 93% of the market share in the banking industry. And essentially, yes, banks are profit motivated. That doesn't necessarily mean in our perspective that they should be able to position themselves where they're earning a profit, because that still ultimately leaves so many people far behind. With particulars to cost, I just want to reiterate that showing them the cost sharing model of ATMs could be compelling to understanding why cooperating with the other banks could ultimately benefit them, because they get to maintain their customer base and their branding as part of that. So that's my response to your question. I feel like Oftab also wants to say something.
No.
Oh, he does not, shockingly.
It's a pretty good instinct, though. Olivia Smith, the team's coach, has generously ceded her time to the public good for more questions. So I'm opening it up to the floor. Okay, and we're not going to start with Dan Weinstock. He can't be first in every session. Andrew, though. Andrew can be first.
Yeah, and that's Daniel's question. Yeah, that's right. Just before I ask my question, just an anecdote which probably has nothing to do with your presentation, but we renovated recently, which I don't recommend. But I felt I had to get some cash out of the bank, which exceeded the amount I could take out from the machine. And so I went to the branch. I said I need $1,500, and they said we don't carry cash anymore. They literally don't have cash. And I said, you have tellers, and the tellers there are only to upsell me on various products. And she said I could raise your limit. And I said, well, that's not enough. And she said, well, you have to come back tomorrow. Like, I was like actually shocked. So vulnerable community right here. Yeah. So my actual question, though, is on the supply side or access side, I think this is excellent. What about the usage side? I was expecting at some point for you guys to advocate for legislation about the right to use cash or retailers and so on. Did that? Where's that in your presentation or in your thinking?
Good question.
It's an excellent question. Thank you so much. So we focused on cash access for reasons that we wanted to focus on cash-dependent groups, but it did come up, merchant acceptance, and currently there's over 90% acceptance of cash by merchants. So we never focused our efforts there. And recommendation 3 points to standing up a cash access committee to look into what the legislative future of cash would look like. Right now, from the literature and stakeholder consultations, what is clear to us is that merchants will accept the payment method chosen by consumers. I don't know if that answers that. Yeah. Thank you.
You want to go on?
I think it's unwise for us to make a legislative recommendation without actually speaking to all of the cash-dependent populations in Canada. We just spoke to 4. That's number one. And number 2, we see the Cash Access Committee as a mechanism to actually talk to vulnerable populations who are cash dependent. I think it's important for us to recognize that we only spoke to advocacy groups who represent the interests of cash dependent populations. So bottom line, you can't make good public policy without actually talking to the public who you're making the policy for. Therefore, a Cash Access Committee is our workaround to answer exactly the question that you asked.
Okay, on my question list, I have Dan Weinstock, followed by Lynn, and I'm just going to say that Olivia can jump in anytime she wants. And the jury too. Fine. She says the jury, then the jury it is. And anytime, fine. Anyway. It's a free-for-all. Go. All right, Dan Weinstock.
And those on the live
stream?
Mom?
No, Andrew is done.
I knew that you were going to do that to me.
I love it.
So
okay.
Lynn is
so
next.
Lynn is up.
One more comment, which is that
Hold on, you need the mic.
Sir.
Starting the sort of, elderly Canadians thing at 60, I think is probably, a bit low. You might want to revisit that.
I think it's okay. I'm feeling vulnerable too, like Andrew. Okay. Lynn.
Hello. Hey, team. Thanks for a great presentation. Your sponsor is the Bank of Canada. You also mentioned the Big 6 banks and also fringe banks. I'm wondering if you came across anything in your research on Indigenous-owned and led financial institutions, whether they're on reserve or not, With the growing prevalence of Indigenous institutional capacity, and we're very much in an era of truth and reconciliation, did you see any overlap with how Indigenous financial institutions would be implicated in relation to your less cash society policy challenge?
Thank you for the question. We did come across Indigenous institutions, and it was one of the questions that came up when we were asking Indigenous stakeholders whether or not the banking institution could be funneled through this mechanism. However, considering all four recommendations are supposed to umbrella all of the vulnerable groups, it would be difficult to just focus on Indigenous banking. Additionally, with the market share of the big six from stakeholders that we've also spoken to, it does seem to be the case that depending on the location of the nearest bank branch, some Indigenous groups, whether on or off reserve, will be banking with the big six banks. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I'm going to go to Olivia.
Okay, I want to say good job. I'm very happy with your presentation, but my question really comes back to the one Brenda asked, if there was any additional recommendation that might have been outside of the scope of what you did for your project that you might want to add.
Yes, the answer is yes. There are quite a few additional recommendations, and it's just very interesting because we worked very hard to funnel it into ones we felt were the most salient, the most applicable, and the easiest, the most feasible in this circumstance. Postal banking is a very popular concept, especially in the UK. It came up quite a bit because that was one of the models that the UK took on when they were dealing with the same issue. Postal banking, for those of you who do not know, means using a post office as a banking hub and able to do your financial services there. Essentially, we looked at the reality in Canada and did some research and discovered that we felt that it would not be necessarily as feasible here, given some of the circumstances with the postal system. And we also felt that maybe it was too broad of a solution that wasn't specific enough to the individual community issues, which is why we settled, I think, on the Community Cash Connect model rather than going for postal banking, which we felt was maybe too a blanket of approach given the current circumstances. Other things that came up were federal legislation, which I think we addressed earlier. We decided that we did not have enough information and felt that it would be better to prescribe the committee in order to determine the future of federal legislation with regards to protection of cash. Those were the two major ones. Thank you, Olivia. We love you.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Isabel. Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your great presentation. It was super informative, and I learned a lot. You talked a lot about how folks in those vulnerable groups access cash. I'm also wondering if you considered where they access cash, whether that's through ATMs in particular locations or anything else that you might have come up in your research. But also, if it's outside of the scope, no worries.
So during stakeholder consultations, we realized that vulnerable groups actually turn to what we refer to as fringe banks. And this is where they feel more welcomed, more willing to go get access cash services, including seeking loans, tax refund advancers. And these fringe banks actually are not that great just because they have high fees, are very exploitative. And so the codes that we're implementing and proposing to implement are served to build relationships with mainstream financial banks in order to get vulnerable communities, including Indigenous peoples, to turn to financial institutions instead of fringe banks.
I'd like to add one thing.
Neil Bauer.
Wait, I wanted to add one more point. I'm so sorry. The majority of Canadians right now typically will use bank branches and ATMs to access their cash. And I have data to back that up from Jerry Buckland's research, but I don't have those numbers on hand. Fringe banks are prevalent because of the convenience they provide people. And so research has shown that those who find the most convenient option to be fringe banks will utilize them, even though they are aware of the higher costs associated. Just to clarify. Thank you.
Neil.
I'd like to ask another maybe left field question. So you've talked about the good side of cash in all the ways that you have, and it's really informative. But there's also a dark side to cash, and one of the biggest users of cash is organized crime and cash is used for gray market and black market transactions. Having worked at FinTrack, our anti-money laundering organization, I recognize the shift to a less cash society is maybe a good thing. But I'm wondering if you have any comments on that darker side of cash that you came up with in your discussions.
Thank you, Neil. So, yes, there are positive implications to a less cash society. And one of the earliest findings that we had was this project called Project Play, if I'm not mistaken. It was a collaboration between FinTrack and a human trafficking entity whose name I cannot remember, an entity which was trying to tackle human trafficking, who worked with FinTrack to identify financial trends, money laundering trends, and so forth. So yes, it does help in sort of allowing frameworks to monitor and oversee financial transactions to tackle laundering. Another one of our findings was that one of the stopgaps that financial institutions have in play is that if you want to, say, withdraw a large amount of cash, if you want to withdraw, say, above $10,000, they'll make you report it. And that report goes to FinTrack. So I think those are important stopgaps in place which are there to prevent fraudulent, illicit activities. The other benefits, if you want to know the benefits of less cash society, is convenience and ease. But this is all contingent, as I said, on every single person being able to access A, the internet, and B, being digitally literate, C, being financially literate, and D, being sort of welcomed across financial institutions, which Megan so beautifully explained what we can do via the codes to address the lack of address the mistrust between vulnerable populations and financial institutions.
Okay, thank you, team. Great job.